everybody. Welcome to another episode of Emerging Proud with, again, the lovely Dr. Mick Collins, who's joining us today to talk about your new book,
Yep.
The Visionary Spirit. Amazing new book. Just before we delve into that, just wanted to say thank you publicly to Mick, who has been a stalwart supporter of the Emerging Proud campaign right from the beginning and a brilliant mentor to me. So thank you, Mick, for joining us again.
It's brilliant. Well, I really love taking part in all the work that Emerging Proud is doing. I totally believe in it. I totally want to support it. And, I really, really appreciate everything you're doing in the world to bring more awareness to this whole issue of transformation and in consciousness. So it's great.
I'm excited to talk to you about your book.
Thank you.
I know you don't like being called a genius, but I always think when I read your stuff, it's like it is genius how you've woven, politics, economics, the transliminal world, ecology, all into one kind of picture of how our utopian world could be. So we're going to talk a bit about that today, about how you've kind of managed to interweave all of those subjects. But first of all, maybe if you could let people know what inspired you to write your new book, and is it a follow-on to The Unselfish Spirit, which was your last publication?
It is. It follows on nicely from The Unselfish Spirit, which is my first book, looking at laying the foundations for the transpersonal in relation to human development and in relation to human action, doing in a world that's in crisis, which I argued in the book is a spiritual crisis. I'm not the first person to have said that, but I underline a very strong message in The Unselfish Spirit. And this book follows on from that very strongly as well, by really going into the visionary energies of who we are as human beings, what that means individually and what that means collectively. And one of the things that the genesis of this book happened when I was living in a Buddhist monastery in 1983. I went in. 3 years after that, I had a Kundalini awakening after doing 3 years study and meditation, and I was unprepared for that. But if I reflect on it now, 32 years on, I can now think, actually, I was awoken by visionary energies that galvanized my visionary journey. And in some ways, it's helped me make sense of the visionary spirit because I've tried to be faithful to the journey in the last few decades. So yes, you're absolutely right. It's come from the Unselfish Spirit, and it is a manifestation of my encounter with visionary energies and how I got to grips with them, because it wasn't all easy.
Wow, no.
No.
Not at all. Wonderful. I hope this is okay, but I know you've written the book in 3 parts, so it'd be good to delve a bit into each part of those of the book. So I've written a little synopsis of kind of what I've taken from each of those, and just if I could ask you maybe to expand on that a bit.
Love to.
So part 1 you've called the imaginal lineage. And you say that scientism is an impediment to holism, and that overinvestment in hyper-rationalism is the problem of our age. So if you could just kind of maybe talk a bit about that in layman's terms for people like me.
Okay, so as you know, I love science. I worked for many years in a medical science faculty in a university, lecturing and writing papers and researching. So I love science. I'm not anti-science, but I've got a bit weary of something, a dogma or a belief system called scientism, where essentially there's a very reductive worldview which says everything we know about the material world we'll know through our 5 senses, and everything will be known and can be revealed in that way. And I just thought that doesn't tie up with nearly every culture on this planet that has a belief of something beyond and supernatural potentially. I believe in the supernatural. I have no problem with that word. But there are quarters in science, particularly in scientism, which says, no, that can't happen. And they, in a way, will use language like trying to get rid of false ideas and myths that are perpetuating a misunderstanding about reality, such as karma and angels and what have you. And in some ways, I think the folly in that is to try and disprove something using a reductive and material method, because people's experiences don't bear that out. So I just think, yeah, that reduction is a type of hyper-rationalism. And the way I write about it in the book is it's like a defense against something that is unknown and unknowable to that mindset. And so it's defended against it, and it will then sort of probe it by saying it's irrational, it's not real, this is what's real. And there are proponents of that worldview out there, and the consequences of that for me are a bit dangerous as well, because what if people have awakenings which can't be explained? Thankfully, holistic science, people we know about, are going into the route and showing more about that world has validity. But there are people in strong threads that are trying to hold to the old guard. And I think it's worth mentioning that at the beginning of the book as an impediment to holism and an impediment to engaging the imaginal lineage. So I really wanted to lay that out at the beginning.
Love that, and I'd love how it kind of segues into the next bit about like how you just described that it being a defence, and that always comes from fear.
Yes. Yes.
So we're talking about the shadow here, and the unconscious, unacknowledged shadow. So in part 2, you talk about the redemptive quest, and the key barrier to our collective healing is our shadow.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it says for me, I don't know if you can sort of talk from your perspective about this, Mick, but it felt counterintuitive to me to delve into my shadow. So I kind of resisted that for a long time. Yeah. Because when you first have an awakening, it's like you just want to be compassionate and look at the love and the light. Yeah. And yet looking at evil or our darkness feels counterintuitive. But actually, I've come to realise that that's, like you talk about Jung saying that 80% of the shadow is gold.
Pure gold, yeah.
Would you mind?
So lovely. And just to I'd love to do that. Just to quickly put a couple of other bits in the imaginal lineage, part 1. I go on to looking at philosophies in ancient Greece that were very welcoming of mysticism. And Peter Kingsley's work does a great deal to bring that forward. And I give some views on that. It leads on beautifully into the sacred feminine, and also into the eco-imaginal, looking at other cultures and how they've got to grips with this. So, in fact, there's a proposition in the imaginal lineage which is quite. We can see where we're being held back, but we can see there are philosophies and ways of living that can take us forward. And so we get to that point, and it gets to the redemptive quest in part 2. And you're absolutely right. The natural thing to then put in is the shadow, because whenever we go to awaken, we can't help but meet the shadow, because if you're trying to be conscious, you're going to meet that which was not very conscious or split off. And of course, with the shadow, it's the prime mover of self-other distortions. So naturally, what it does, because it has a projection on someone else or something else or a group or whatever, an ideology, it others that side and then glows and basks in its own reflective glory. But of course, that which has been projected is also part of where we need to integrate.
Yeah. Oof.
Yeah.
Ooh. Wow. Oh, I love that. So that's kind of the big thing with duality, because it others. Yeah. So it stops us becoming one.
Yeah, absolutely.
So would you say that that's the biggest mission of humanity now, is to look at our collective shadow?
I think it is, because there's a shadow bypass happening in the world, and you've only got to turn the news on or look at a decent paper, and even some of the other sort of other press shows you pretty much what's going on in the world. But there's some some very powerful things happening in the world right at this moment, which are very shadow and othering. And if we reclaim those projections, we'd be in a better position to then start to look at mobilizing that energy, those visionary energies, which are part of our awakening. And when I had my spiritual crisis in the 80s, and like I said, I've told you before, Stan Grof's book, Spiritual Emergency, hadn't been published at that point. So I had to kind of find my way through it and not end up being hospitalized or something like that. And, if I had been, I had been, but I wasn't. And I met some people who helped me stay a bit on track. But I met the shadow. And one of the things about the shadow is I thought, and I've said this to you before, I thought I was possessed by evil because what was coming up was very unsavoury, quite violent, quite strong and very strongly projected. And then I had to work out what was going on. Eventually, it was through Jung that I realised I was possessed by the unconscious. So there's something there, and I thought, oh, here's an awakening, here's another shift. Now, it's taken me years to get to grips with that. It took me 10 years to make that analysis, through going through psychotherapy training and having psychotherapy. So the shadow needs to be raised up and considered for the beauty that it brings, because here's the wonder. And I think this is where the sacred feminine gives us lots of impetus for that. And we have to be careful, because I think if we don't work with the shadow is not evil, but if we don't address those projections, it seeds the possibilities of evil. So we need to then talk about, well, what does evil look like, and what's that all about?
Yeah, I was remembering something you talk about, how avoiding it propagates the seeds of evil.
It propagates it.
Love that.
Yeah, so it's hard, and then it's propagated, then it's grown and then harvested. You can see it happening in the world. So I think there's something about, we've got to have that conversation about what is going on. Ecocide could be our collective evil, because we're aware that we're damaging the planet, which will have impacts on people, other species, and whole communities worldwide. Species extinction is happening right now. If we're aware of that and we're carrying on as normal, is that a moral evil? It's a question.
Yeah, I love how, just going back to how you're talking about the shadow and validating it, and actually when you look at our own personal evil and feel like you're possessed, when you realise actually we're just possessed by the unconscious. I'm just imagining what a gift that would be, to give that validation to somebody who, has acted on those feelings, those impulses, and committed a crime or violent act or whatever. If actually those feelings could be validated before they're acted upon, that's integration, isn't it? That's kind of healing, I suppose.
I think so.
How would you see that playing out?
Well, some of the things that's where I see, question, I know it is, but I know we have a shared interest, and we haven't spoken about this, but I wonder whether it might. I don't know the answer ultimately, but we both like restorative justice.
Yeah.
So one of the things about restorative justice is things happen by people acting upon other people, and consequences being had which are sometimes very unsavoury and really you can talk about loss of life and all manner of things. And restorative justice, as you know, is about those people meeting and having honest conversations about the impact of their actions upon each other. And I think if we think about the world as an interconnected whole, and when we get to near-death experiences we'll talk about this, but when we see the world as an integrated whole, that which we do in the world and unto others, we do to ourselves. Restorative justice naturally fits as a lovely way of redemption. So I think that's funny enough, I've been talking to another person about writing another book in the future, and restorative justice would be a big part of that. So, because I think then you really can get to grips with putting your hands up saying, I have done this.
My part in this is...
And somebody else who may not have done anything as, let's say, I don't like the word good and bad, but let's say as difficult as that, might be able to say, but you know what? I turned a blind eye to that in my community for years. Who knows how it goes?
And it's a lot of it is human instinct, isn't it? To turn a blind eye because we're worried about upsetting people or judging people or whatever it might be. But when that's the counterintuitive part to me, I think.
It is. You wouldn't think to go there, would you?
Yeah.
So, I mean, I think there's something here where so naturally, if we're going to go with the imaginal lineage, the redemptive quest means looking at what is the shadow and how does that, if we don't deal with it, play into some of the evils that we're all complicit in some way, shape, form or another, even by actions or non-actions or actions done in our name on behalf of our government. I mean, as we speak now, our government are actually considering right now, today, their response to how to go in at Syria. And, these are huge questions. I mean, I'm not going to get political at this moment, but I just want to say things will be done in our name as well. And so, I think we have so collective awareness is a big issue.
Yeah.
And
so how do you see things moving on? So is that coming to part 3?
No, well, part 2 would be the beginnings of that. Okay. So I think but in the redemptive quest in part 2, we're looking at laying out the shadow and what we consider as evil as a question to be looked at might be an interesting point. The interesting thing, Matthew Fox said, the opposite of evil isn't good, it's the sacred. Now, I love that because now you're talking about bringing that into our sacred quest. So if you look at a mythical alignment of that, you see, let's say, Jesus and Satan are 2 characters that might have a mythical understanding it. Now, I take a different viewpoint to your standard mainstream view on that. But, we've got things we can use as reference points for our conversation. So let's say we can move into something then a bit more spirited. And I think now we're looking at the ancestral lineage that we're part of, as part of our redemptive quest. The ancestors in our culture don't get much airtime. In a lot of other cultures, they're consulted.
Yeah.
And Jung, in the Red Book, writes about, the dead, and he only makes a very brief reference in the Red Book to the lament of the dead. And James Hillman and Sonu Shamanadze wrote a book called The Lament of the Dead, honouring Jung's revival of that ancestral lineage. And I think that's really an important thing. And a friend of ours who we both know, I'm sure he won't mind us mentioning this, whose birthday it is today, Mark Wentworth, talks about we're all future ancestors. And I love that. I love that because if we're future ancestors, then what's our legacy right now that we're taking forward?
Yes.
Redemption.
Gosh, wow.
So how are we redeeming that?
Responsibility of what we're leaving, yeah.
Exactly. So looking back at our lineage, looking at what was done that wasn't wholly good, looking what was done that was great, drawing on the best of that, dealing with some of the shadow stuff that's coming through the collective shadow, working forward, honouring the ancestors, honouring ourselves as future ancestors. And then it gets to the realm of the daemon. So the spiritedness of our bringing our character forward. So that's the 4 parts of the redemptive quest.
Wow, amazing. I was just as well thinking when you were talking before about how the shift from sort of scientism and very left brain logic sort of male thing, which is categorised as male thinking, from the head to the heart, and you talk about the sacred feminine a lot, and how that's kind of more the mystical, emotive side of life,
getting
the less tangible.
Going in. And so in the book I speak to Chenka Jane Sunderland, who's a wise woman locally who I'm good friends with, and she lays labyrinths down. In fact, Norwich Cathedral has a labyrinth created by her, as does the Shoemaker Institute, as well as one of our parks locally. And something about the labyrinth is about this way of going in and counterclockwise and clockwise and counterclockwise, and eventually getting a bit disorientated and getting to the centre, which is like a void, and then not knowing, and then waiting to see what comes, and then bringing that out in the world. So that's very much the feminine,
Ooh.
So
yes, and leading us into the 3rd part.
Yes.
Because the thing that I'd written down from here was you mentioned the connection between the imaginal realm and connection to all of life and our human potential through the song of the universe. And we do that through doing. Yeah. Can you speak?
So where I got to with that was, it's bringing lots of threads together. So, that's been my job. This is nothing in here. Well, there's a couple of things that are mine in there that are unique, I suppose. But really, it's about bringing together lots of people's ideas and trying to lay it out as a bit of a path. And what I found interesting in the Emancipatory Edge, that's part 3, is I start off with looking at near-death experiences, and 2 good friends of ours, Kelly Walsh and Penny Sartori, have done some great work in that area, as have many others. And we've learned from them that one of the main things that comes up in the near-death experience is a life review. And what people see in the life review is how their actions impacted on others, and they feel the consequences of those actions on others. I got very excited about that because my thing is about doing and action and being. And I thought, wow, well, straight away, if I've done something to that person and I didn't know how it impacted them, when I die, I'm going to feel what I did. Where's that held? So that's the kind of way I go around life, scratching my head, thinking, where, how, who, So then I get very excited and interested about that. So then you start looking at, well, if we're living in this wonderful matrix of consciousness and connectivity, then you can start to think, wow, what is that then? If there are action lines that are really energized, and to bring awareness and consciousness to that would be phenomenal. So that's how I started to get into the indigenous material about the song lines. And Hildegard von Bingen, who spoke about the song of the universe and the angelic, the way it comes through. So the emancipatory edge is quite a mystical path. So I start off with looking at near-death experiences. It ventures into what we're doing with ourselves today and looks at robotics, transhumanism and transpersonalism. So I played that one out a bit. And then it goes into Jung, active imagination, bringing forth. So when the daemon's activated, the true character, so ethos anthropoi daemon, character is fate. That was a statement made by James Hillman, Jungian analyst. Ethos anthropoi daemon, character is fate. So getting to meet the daemon, like Jung and Socrates, very consciously they met that potential. For Jung, he met Philemon, and Philemon came to him. I could say a lot about that, but it's in the book. Philemon came to him and taught him about the soul and his journey into the soul, and that was his working with that material, and then his character emerged. So I love that.
I was just thinking as well how that really links into the interview that I did with Nicole, another friend of ours in Australia who's done her research about how we become more of ourselves when we meet our daemon or whatever however you want to express it. The character becomes more. It
comes forth. It begins. Yes, because she mentioned that in light of her research participants who then found more of themselves. Becoming more of who they are. And I absolutely agree with that. I think that's spot on. And that's what you seem to get with when you listen to the call of the daemon and let it live. But you have to use a bit of discernment, to really work that. You don't just run with it willy-nilly.
Yeah, that's an interesting one actually, because it takes a lot of discerning, doesn't it? It's like, is this coming from ego? Is this coming from something other? How would you describe that, Mick?
Well, I mean, Jung, I love synchronicities might help us with that. So we know we're on the path when synchronicities come in. I mean, I talk about a few of my synchronicities in there, but Jung's synchronicity was great. When he was in his garden, he decided to paint Philemon to get a bit more a sense of what this character was like, and he saw in a vision that Philemon had kingfisher wings. And so he was painting the kingfisher wings on Philemon, and then he decided to have a break. And he walked in his garden. There was a dead kingfisher on his lawn. Next time he saw one in that locality was 50 years on. Wow. They were rare occurrences. Yeah. So he saw that as a synchronicity that he was. But what's interesting is the kingfisher was dead. So there's something about reviving that through his work. I thought that was a beautiful parallel. And then if we compare that to, say, someone like, let's say, I use this example in the book, Hitler's consciously working with that toing and froing of what's coming up, working with the synchronicities, and that ego self-axis starts to grow. Let's compare that to someone like Hitler, who felt himself to be a messianic saviour, who had visions of a new way of living in Germany in the 1930s, but he didn't offer any work on his shadow projections. He othered. He started to build a head of steam around that. And rather than becoming angelic destiny, where he really fulfilled his heart and opened spiritually, he became a bit of a demon. So, this work just takes great discernment. And I think that's, you can see that in historical characters that have done the work or not. Yeah, absolutely. Wow, gosh. I just written an article actually for Assist about that, really? about kind of how a huge part of the integration journey is working on our own
shadow,
Absolutely.
and actually how you fight it for so long, and
Yeah.
it's really hard to kind of fight that egoic need to be successful or someone or whatever. But actually, what I love about what you just said, it really fits with my thoughts around how this is all about a peer revolution, and how we all have to get vulnerable and break down those facades and look at our shadows and collaborate with each other and not want to control.
And not judge and not self-judge. I mean, in the book, I share a pretty deep part of my shadow work, and I won't go into it here, but it's a very vulnerable thing to share that level of information in a book. And I decided that if I'm talking about what you just said, which I totally agree with, that somehow the consciousness raising activity is peer-to-peer, and that we're growing as a collective consciousness in that we consult the collective unconscious and we come up through and consciously connect with each other to move forward, then we have to meet the shadow. And you can't bypass that. No shadow bypass.
No.
I mean, it's got to happen.
Yeah.
So I'm really pleased to hear that. I think, I mean, we haven't had this conversation, but it's interesting that
It's really interesting that it's come up now. And I've said this, recently in interviews, I'm so grateful to academics like you who are kind of really researching, and, I haven't got the brain to kind of put all this stuff together. But it just, everything that I'm kind of doing with the campaign and where that's coming from my heart about the right things to do is being validated in what you're saying in the research. So
Brilliant.
I'm so grateful to that. Just wondering how you kind of, in your, maybe you want to say a bit more about part 3, but in your afterword as well, something that really stood out to me was you talk about warriors of the rainbow, and that there was a prophecy around that. And I just love that it's like such an academic book. You bring all of this stuff in. It's just, that's what I think is genius.
Well, the genius is always, of course, I've got to say that, because you know what my viewpoint on that is no person is ultimately a genius. But it comes to the daemon that we listen to, and we're fueled by that. So that's where the root of the word genius comes from. Daemon, take it to Roman, genus, genius. So it's a spirit.
Yay.
So I've just been listening. All right, and put a bit of work in as well.
Yeah, a lot of work.
But interestingly, just to say a little bit about the Emancipatory Age, part 3, it goes on to, say, looking at Jung, but then look at the spiritual art of woo-woo, and I think this is an important thing. You hear a lot of people say spirituality is just woo-woo and stuff like that, and that, I believe, is a consequence of that sort of scientism worldview which says we can't prove it's all a load of whatever, flaky.
Fear.
Yeah, something like that. I think it is, or, whatever it is. Or I'm not going to entertain stuff that's all fairy tales, I've heard people say. I love fairy tales, so, there's a lot of them in the book. But here's the interesting thing. When I examine that woo-woo thing, you realise that it has no foundation whatsoever. It cannot be substantiated. It's a shadow. It's prejudicial. So we have to then say, not attack that, but stand firm and say, no, that's not the way it is. And the way I've done that is, rather than going woo-woo with a W-O-O, I've gone woo with a U, woo-woo. And that comes from the Taoist Wu Chi, which is we're in a universe of wholeness, from which it's formless, from which form arises. That's where yin yang comes from. And within that, we can act with Wu Wei, action through least doing and least effort. So the woo-woo, the woo-woo does have a place, but not the shadowy woo-woo with the W-O, with the U. Woo-woo.
Woo-wei.
I
like that. I think I'm woo-weighing.
Oh, you are. Me too. I mean, so I just thought, let's have an intelligent conversation about this, rather than it going backwards and forwards with people saying, And I hopefully in chapter 1 I say scientism is an impediment to holistic living, and in the last chapter, in the spiritual art of woo-woo, I say this is why we can embrace a philosophy of woo-woo, but from the Taoist perspective as an interesting counterpoint.
Wow, that's incredible. I mean, the amount of research and years of study that has gone into writing this book.
There's a lot of work gone into it. I'll own that.
It's incredible.
Yeah.
Yes.
But you said then the afterword, and you mentioned the Warriors of the Rainbow, which is a North American Indian prophecy, which was done, always spoken about in oral traditions. And the Rainbow Warrior from Greenpeace, the ship, the Rainbow Warrior, was always named from that myth. And before I even talk about that, I think I always have to honour the indigenous stories that we draw upon, because, you know, so many examples of indigenous wisdom that have been taken, used and misused. And I really want to honour that tradition. And I've tried to tell the story to say, because it talks about the world of a coming crisis and that the Rainbow Warriors will come back and help us, I feel that is an invitation to the world to live our truth. I've got goosebumps.
I just had a big shiver.
Yeah, me too. I think I must have got yours. But I share it because when I hear that, I think, oh my Lord, wow, this is a global myth, but it comes from an indigenous population, and we must honour those stories and those traditions because they've been trivialised and you know, all manner of things have been done. So we have to really honour those traditions, but also say, you know, they're talking about a global context of, and they will come and make the earth good again. And you know, wow.
It's happening, isn't it?
It's happening.
You can see it.
It is. And we have to do our work, you know, we have to do our work to help that. And but one of the things I talk about in the afterword, before the ending of it, which is the myth of the Warriors of the Rainbow, is a man on death row. And it's a really interesting one. In America, Jarvis J. Masters, he's been on death row for 20 years. And he's used his time there now as a time of awakening. And he was initiated into the tantric path of Tara. He was initiated into that path by a Tibetan Lama who came into the prison and did the initiation with him. And he writes about freedoms from writings from death row from a point of view of freedom. And he talks about now awakening his heart on death row. You know, I see people like that as my real, wow, that is impressive. You know, and I think to myself, if you can do it there, it puts a hell of a lot back to me. I think, you know, I can do better than what I'm doing with all these freedoms that I've got. He's doing it in that cell and he's communicating that to the world. And I'm just so, what a blessing.
It's amazing, isn't it? But I'm just thinking about what you said before as well, and how important and vital it is actually to be compassionate to ourselves and where we're at and what we're doing, because, you know, I've berated myself for a long time about not doing enough, but it's like actually then you lower your vibration and you add to the negativity of the world. So it's getting that, everything's balance, isn't it?
It is, and I'm so glad you said that, because I feel exactly the same way. And it's a bit like William Irwin Thompson, who I write about in the book quite a bit, said something very lovely. And he said, with shadow work, we have to then be able to understand that others' shadows in other people are running, and to not condemn that, but to start to have a different dialogue around this. And I think that's where restorative justice has a great part of it. I don't think we've even touched the potential of where that can go. But I know other people have been looking at that in light of an environmental context. That's certainly not my original idea. That's somebody else that I've spoken to recently, looking at in our relation to environmentalism, to each other, to disadvantaged communities, to restore our sense of getting back to something which is vital. And I think that's a spirited vision, you know, so the visionary spirit is, how do we open ourselves to these bigger questions? I mean, one of the things we get from near-death experiences is people come back when they're revived, and those that have had experiences which have been really profoundly awakening, not everyone remembers their experiences, but those that do come back and they, refuse to live in fear, they want to live in love, and they know they have to serve.
Yes.
Well, wow. Yeah. What do you do with information like that? And then, you know, restorative justice, imagine that together with restorative justice from that perspective.
Okay, so it's just making me think. So when somebody has a spiritual awakening, spontaneous spiritual awakening, it's the same, isn't it? We come back with the same feelings as we do if we have a near-death experience. We're here to serve. You know, life is about something bigger, and it can be blissful for a while, but then you can easily sink into despair and despondency, and like actually don't know what your role is, because there's a huge gap between what you believe you can do as a human being and who you know you are as a spirit. So what would your advice be to somebody, Mick, who's maybe feeling that now, maybe a bit despondent, they kind of get this, to listen to their own daemon, to find out what they're, who they really are.
Yeah. I think that's really the question of the age, to be honest, Katie. I think you've just raised the question of the age. Could I answer that? I don't know. I find it hard. I can certainly give a response to it, and I'd like to try. But I think it's a brilliant question. And something about what you're doing really appeals to me. And that's why I think we kind of always get on well around this subject, because I see what you're doing as peer work with getting people to talk together and share their experiences, you know, the difficult, the enlivened, the tragic, the sad, and people get together and finding a way together in human. Sorry, I was going to say harmonious, because it's not always harmony, is it? No. But it's in human ways that are well, maybe harmonising with something which is bigger. That's possibly on the agenda, but it's not straightforward. And with regard to the daemon, I mean, to my mind, the daemon is like where I find it useful to look at the daemon is it's a bit like the guardian angel of our Western tradition, and the daemon and the guardian angel have some similarities. So I call upon my guardian angel for all manner of help, and funny enough, little synchronicities happen sometimes and not all the time, but I wonder whether it's about a dialogue of trusting the connections that we're having, talking with other peers for support, and then finding ways of grounding that in the world and going forward, and knowing that it's not going to be straightforward. Yes. I mean, my last 30, I went to the monastery 35 years ago. Before that, I was on the road for 6 years going into monasteries in Asia. I was very interested in this in the 70s. It blew up in the mid-80s. And I've been trying to just work with it ever since. And, some days it's smooth and other days it's really tricky. Yeah. So, I write in there about some recent experiences where I completely, the wheels come off a little bit, and I just try to find a way of how can I get that back. So I think we've got our work to do, but I really do think what you're doing with peer groups and others, assist really.
And wider, Hearing Voices Network, Dropless Disorder, it doesn't have to be transpersonal, anything that's human to human and kind of helping us be more naturally.
Absolutely. I think that's the way forward, and in some ways reviving the stories that really sing to us, that bring us alive. That's why I've put a lot of stories in there. Rumpelstiltskin, there's a joke in there about Rumpelstiltskin, but there's the spirit in the wood, when you meet the spirit Mercury, the woodcutter. There's Fitcher's bird, there's Pandora, there's Adam and Eve, there's Jesus who meets Satan in the desert. There's all manner of the warriors of the rainbow. There's lots of stories that the shoemaker and the elves. Yeah, that's in there. So when you go to bed at night, and then all of a sudden the shoemaker gets up in the morning, and then the elves have made all these nice shoes. It's a lovely metaphor for you can't solve it all with your ego. Go to bed, and all of a sudden the answers come.
Let go.
Yeah. So there's something about these stories which are wise, and there are visionary traditions. Yeah. So I love them.
It's brilliant. If you want to get your hands on a copy,
thank you.
I'll share the booking link below here. But Mick, if you want to, where can people get hold of it?
You can get that at Permanent Publications in the UK, and their website, there's a link to it there. And in the US, it's Chelsea Green, who are the publishers that are dealing with that. And of course, other outlets, booksellers
are available.
Trying to be so careful. But our publishers are probably, good to go and work with them.
Yeah, wonderful. Thanks so much for joining us. Thank you,
Katie.
Mick. It's lovely to see you as
lovely
always.
to see you too. Thank you. And thank you for doing it here together.
Yes, it's
our
lovely.
First time together.
Online.
Yeah.
Okay. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye. Thank you.